Hello, and welcome back to the Tik-A Tee Method for this second video in our two-part video series on ties and invisible bar lines. In today's video for week 17, I'm just going to dive right into the analysis of two exercises, and we're going to perform them together. So today's video, therefore, will be a little bit shorter. That being said, if you have not checked out week 16's video, it's so important that you do that before proceeding here, because I talked about what ties are and how they work in music notation and how they can work in conjunction with invisible bar lines to better compartmentalize 4/4 measures and help us distinguish beats 1 and 2 from beats 3 and 4, for example. A lot of great stuff in week 16 and really important before moving on here. So I hope you'll stick around for the whole video. I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's get right to the first exercise. Alright, here we are at the first exercise for today's video, week 17, exercise A. And you can see up here there's a sentence. Whole notes are one of the exceptions of the invisible bar line rule. Now please realize the reason that I'm stressing up until this point the importance of the invisible bar line and trying to observe it in 4/4 time is simply to help beginning musicians and even intermediate and beyond understand the compartmentalization of measures and how we can more easily digest measures when they're broken up into 2 equal halves and 4/4 time. So that's not to say that whole notes don't exist and dotted half notes don't exist and how dare us put a dotted half note in a measure. That is not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that I want us to understand invisible bar lines and their purpose, because I think there is some intentionality here to help us learn rhythms a little better. So all that being said, let's move on to the analysis. And in the first measure, we have a whole note. Now, whole notes in common time, in 4/4 time, are very easily seen, easily digestible, easily understood by beginning musicians and beyond. So we don't need to compartmentalize a whole note. We know it's a note that lasts all 4 beats in the measure. However, what if we did want to compartmentalize this measure so that we didn't break the invisible bar line? Well, we would have a half note. Then we would have our invisible bar line right here. Then we would have another half note on beats 3 and 4, and we would connect those notes with a tie, our musical addition symbol. So a half note plus a half note equals 4 beats, the same as, equivalent to, a whole note. But in this case, I wouldn't write anything other than a whole note, because a whole note is the correct way to write a note that lasts the entire measure in 4/4 time. Does it break the invisible bar line? Yes, it does. But again, I'm only stressing the invisible bar line as a purpose, as an intention to help musicians distinguish beats 1 and 2 from beats 3 and 4. But in the case of a whole note, we don't really need to do that. Let's move on to measure 2. And measure 2 is just a bit more complicated than measure 1. Let's check it out. We have a quarter note on beat 1. We have a dotted 8th note to 16th note rhythm on beat 2. And the 16th note is tied over the invisible bar line into beat 3. So if I was to draw the invisible bar line, I'd put it right here. It would squeeze between that 16th note and that 8th note. And I would put beat 3 here with parentheses around it because we're not going to re-articulate it. And I explained that in week 16's video, so I hope you remember. This next 8th note on the upbeat of 3, we will articulate. Then we have an 8th note on beat 4 and another 8th note on the upbeat of 4 that's tied over the bar line. So we're now adding an 8th note plus a dotted 8th note that enters here on beat 1. So I'm going to put a parentheses around beat 1 because we're not going to re-articulate that. We will, however, articulate this ah right here, which is the last 16th note of beat 1 in measure 3. Then we've got a quarter note on beat 2. Our invisible bar line is right here, nice and easy to see. Beat 3 is this quarter rest. Beat 4, we've got an 8th note with an upbeat 8th note here on the upbeat of 4 tied again over the bar line to another 8th note. So I'm going to write 1 with a parentheses here because we're not going to re-articulate that beat 1. The upbeat of beat 1, we've got this 8th note. Then we've got another dotted 8/16 on beat 2 with the 16th tied again over to beat 3. So I'm going to squeeze my invisible bar line right between these two 16th notes. And we're going to add those two 16th notes together because a tie is a musical addition symbol. Ah will be the words that we say. And again, I'll demonstrate these in a moment. So beat 3 is going to have that parentheses around it because we're not going to re-articulate beat 3. Then we have a Tik-A happening right after beat 3, going into beat 4, which is this quarter note here. So I want to go back and demonstrate a couple measures for you. So let me demonstrate first measure 2 so you know what measure 2 sounds like. So I'm just going to put the tempo right here. I'll count it off. Go ahead and follow along with me once. Then I'll do it a second time and you can do it with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, ya, ti, 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 ya, ta. So you see how I went all the way to beat 2 in that third measure? Try doing it with me this time. This is measure 2 going into measure 3. 1, 2, here it is. Ta, ti, ah, ti, 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 ah, ta. So that's pretty cool. Some really fun rhythms there. Now let me demonstrate beat 4 of measure 3 going all the way through measure 4. I'll do it once for you and then again you can join me on it. So I'm going to just count off 3 beats. Then I'm going to enter on beat 4 of measure 3. Here it is. 1, 2, 3. Ti, 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 ah, ah, Tik-A ta. Again, another fun rhythm. Try doing it with me. I'm going to count off 3 beats and you're going to enter with me on beat 4 of measure 3. Let's try it together. 1, 2, 3. Ti, 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 ah, ah, Tik-A ta. Although they add a little more complexity, ties can create some really fun 8th note or 16th note syncopation. You just have to know how they work and how to use them and how to see that compartmentalization. Okay, let's move on to measure 5. All right, we've got a quarter note here on beat 1, then we've got 2 8th notes here on beat 2, with the second 8th note being tied over into beat 3. So the invisible bar line is going to squeeze in right between this 8th note and that first 16th note. I'm going to put a parenthesis around my beat 3 because we're not going to articulate it. Then we will say ah, tik, ah, going into beat 4 of measure 5. You'll notice that the ending of measure 4 and the ending of measure 5 are very, very similar, if not identical. Going on to measure 6, we've got this half rest on beats 1 and 2, invisible bar line. Then beats 3 and 4 here are tied over the bar line into beats 1 and 2 here, which I can put a parenthesis around all of this if I wanted to, because I'm not going to re-articulate any of that. A half note plus a half note equals a whole note, but we can't write a whole note here because we've got a bar line. So beats 3 and 4 is a half note. It's tied over the solid bar line into another half note. So we've got a note that lasts 4 beats, but it's not a whole note. Then we have our invisible bar line right here. Then we have beats 3 and 4. In the last measure, measure 8, we have a quarter note, 2 8th notes with that second 8th note tied over the invisible bar line into beat 3. I'll put a parenthesis here because we're not going to re-articulate that. Then the upbeat of 3 is this 8th note, and beat 4 is actually silence. So there is the analysis of exercise 17A. We know what our next step is. We need to throw a metronome on, get our tempo stabilized, find our G3 pitch. That's what I'm going to sing it on, and we're going to vocalize this rhythm together. Let's go do that right now. Okay, the first thing we want to do is remove this ink so you can see the exercise just a little more clearly. I'm going to put the metronome on. I'm sticking with my Boss DB90 this week. Quarter note equals 74 or 74 beats per minute. I'll be vocalizing this on a G3. Now you're welcome to sing that exact pitch with me, or an octave higher, an octave lower, or a different note altogether. But the idea is that you vocalize these rhythms with me. So here we go. Get the metronome started. I'm going to turn that up a little bit so you guys can hear it a little bit better. There it is. Here's the G3 that I'll be singing the exercise on. You pick your poison, pick your note. Here we go. I'm going to count it off. We're going to sing this together. 1, 2, ready, and ta, ta, ti, ya, ti, 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 ya, ta. Ti, 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 ya, Tik-A ta, ta, ti, ti, ya, Tik-A ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ti. Okay. stop the metronome, turn the volume down a little bit on that. And there you have it. There is exercise 17A. I hope you vocalized it with me. There were some really cool rhythms in there with some syncopation, like 8th note and 16th note syncopation. Now, we need to know if we did it correctly. And the way that we check that is we find the MP3s on my website. We find exercise 17A. We go listen to it. Let's go do that right now. Okay, here we are at my website where you can find all 363 of the MP3s that accompany my book. Of course, we are looking at exercise 17A, but as you scroll up and down through my website, you can see all the different weeks here with the accompanying videos. And as we scroll down to week 16 and week 17, you can see that week 16's thumbnail is here to go watch that video. And as soon as this video, week 17, is released, it'll be right to the right-hand side of it. Okay, so let's talk about our three options when we come and listen to these MP3s. Option number one is to just listen to the MP3 and check for our accuracy that way. Option number two is to vocalize along with the MP3, so you would sing the rhythms again. And option three, especially if your principal instrument isn't the voice, you want to break out your instrument and play along with the MP3. That is the final step before moving on to the next exercise or the next rhythmic concept. Okay, without further ado, you've made your decision, option 1, 2, or 3. I'm going to press play on exercise 17A right now. One, two, three, four. Ta, ta, ti, ya, ti, 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 ya, ta. Ti, 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 ya, Tik-A ta, ta, ti, ti, ya, Tik-A ta. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ti. And there you have it, exercise 17A. So that was the MP3. So if you did not choose option 3 and playing it on your instrument, especially if your instrument isn't primarily the voice, now would be the time to do that before moving on to the next exercise. One, two, three, four. Okay, let's move on to exercise 17B. Now there's a statement here. Dotted half notes are also often one of the exceptions to the invisible barline rule. Please don't misinterpret what I'm saying when I stress invisible bar lines. Yes, dotted half notes exist in common time. They can come in on beat 1 or on beat 2, and they last for 3 beats. I emphasize the importance of invisible bar lines and trying to observe them as much as we can in the beginning stages of learning how to read music. It is an educational, intentional purpose that I'm trying to stress invisible bar lines. This is not to say that whole notes can't be used and dotted half notes can't be used. That is not the case. I just think that we should be trying to utilize the invisible bar line whenever we can. But let's face it, a dotted half note is pretty easy to see and pretty easy to understand even for beginning musicians when you see them enter in a 4/4 measure, which is exactly what's happening in measure 1 of exercise 17B. Check this out. We've got a quarter rest on beat 1, then we've got a dotted half note coming in on beat 2 and lasting for 3 beats, right? So it happens all the time in 4/4. But what if I wanted to notate measure 1 to observe the invisible bar line? Here's how I would do it. I'll write it right beneath that measure. So I would have a quarter rest, then I would break up this dotted half note and put a quarter note so that I could observe my invisible bar line, then a half note, Then I would connect them together with a tie that can go over that invisible bar line, and it's a musical addition symbol, so it's going to add the quarter note plus the half note, which equals 3 beats. So if you were to re-notate measure 1 like this, you're observing the invisible bar line. Which one, as a professional musician, would I prefer? Well, I'd probably prefer the dotted half note, frankly, just because it's easy to understand and it's less ink on the page for my brain to have to try to figure out as I'm sight reading. But if we wanted to re-notate it, that's how we would do it. Okay, let's move on to measure 2 and keep analyzing. So we've got a measure full of eighth notes here. So we've got beat 1 here, beat 2, beat 3 that I'm going to parenthesize because we're not going to re-notate it because of that tie, and then beat 4. So in between beats 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, we have the invisible bar line right here. T, 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 T. That's measure 2. So we've got one tie connecting those 2 eighth notes. Okay, on to measure 3. We've got 2 eighth notes. Then we've got a Tik-A Tee happening here with the T being tied over to beat 3, which again, I'll parenthesize since we're not going to re-articulate that. Then on the upbeat here of beat 3, we've got 2 16th notes, and then beat 4 is this quarter note. So measure 3 will sound like this. T, T, Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Ta. Some really cool eighth note syncopation there. Moving into measure 4, we have our weak 6 rhythm, that dotted quarter note to the eighth note, which takes up 2 beats. Then we've got our invisible bar line squeezing right in here with beat 3 on a quarter rest. Beat 4 is this eighth rest, and then the upbeat of beat 4. We have some syncopation. We've got an upbeat eighth note that's flagged there on that one. Okay, so that's the first line. Let's move to the second line in measure 5. And in measure 5, we've got another measure that's filled with eighth notes, only the ties are in different locations than our last measure. Let's check this out. So we've got eighth notes here, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4. We can see those beats now. But now where are the ties happening? The ties are happening on the and or the upbeat of 1 going into 2. So I'm going to parenthesize beat 2 because we're not going to re-articulate that. Then our next one is the and of beat 3 or the upbeat of beat 3 going into beat 4, elongating that note, so we're not going to re-articulate beat 4 either. Here's what measure 5 would sound like. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 T. Do that with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 T. So the ties are creating some eighth note syncopation. Really fun. Let's move on to measure 6. We've got beat 1 here on these 2 eighth notes. Then we've got a T Tik-A here on beat 2, but the last 16th note is being tied over into beat 3, where I will parenthesize because we're not going to re-articulate that. We will articulate this ah right here, that last 16th note, before we say the T here on the upbeat of beat 3, and then the downbeat of 4 will be here. So let me demonstrate measure 6 for you. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 Tik-A Tee Ta. Do that with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 Tik-A Tee Ta. Again, another really fun measure, and the tie this time creates 16th note syncopation because we have to enter right after beat 3 there. Some really cool stuff. Okay, moving on to measure 7, we've got a reversed dotted rhythm here. Okay, so that's going to take up beats 1 and 2. We've got our weak 6's rhythm, which is the dotted quarter note to the eighth note, and we're just swapping it. We're reversing it. So the eighth note's coming first, and then the dotted quarter note creating some eighth note syncopation there. Then we've got our invisible bar line right here. We've got a dotted quarter rest that's going to come in on beat 3, and then the upbeat of beat 4 will be that flagged eighth note right there. Now, I didn't put in invisible bar lines in measure 5 and 6, so let me go do that. Back in measure 5, my invisible bar line, of course, is going to go right between beats 2 and 3 right there, and in measure 6, it's going to go underneath this tie right here. All right, so that tie connects beats 1 and 2 to beats 2 and 3. Okay, now we can move on to measure 8. Okay, we've got a quarter note here on beat 1, another quarter note on beat 2, but it's tied over that invisible bar line to beat 3, creating a note that lasts for 2 beats. I'm going to parenthesize beat 3 because we're not going to re-articulate it, and then beat 4 will be this quarter note right here. There's a lot of good stuff here in exercise 17B, and as you can see, ties can actually create some really cool rhythms. It can create eighth note syncopation. It can create 16th note syncopation. And it can also work in conjunction with invisible bar lines to help you better compartmentalize 4/4 measures. Some really cool stuff. Okay, We've analyzed it. If you need to analyze it a little bit more, if you want to add in the Tik-A Tee verbiage, for example, or even just study it a little longer, feel free to pause the video now and then come back and join me. But I'm going to go right now and perform this exercise. Okay, you know the drill. I'm going to delete all of this ink so we can all see this exercise a little more clearly. I'm going to get the metronome started, and then I'll give us our pitch, and we'll vocalize this rhythm together. Here we go. There's our metronome. Let me just turn it up for you. There we go. That should be good. Here's our G3. At least that's what I'm singing it on. You're welcome to sing it on any pitch you want. I'll give us a count off, and we're off to the races. 1, 2, ready, and ta, Tee, 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 Tik-A Tee, Tik-A ta, ta, Tee. Tee, 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 Tik-A Tee ta, Tee ta. Tee ta, ta, ta. Okay. All right, so you heard I had to sneak in a quick breath there in the end of the first line. Not much time to breathe. There's not many rests in there, and I am definitely not a vocalist, as you probably can tell. But I did my best here to maintain the integrity of the rhythms while breathing whenever I needed to. Okay, we have finished the exercise now. We did it with the metronome, but we don't know if we did it right, if we did it wrong. This is the time we need to go check it against the MP3. So let's go find that for exercise 17B together right now. And here we are, back in my website. We are now going to be listening to exercise 17B. You know what your 3 options are, so make your decision, because I'm going to press play on the MP3 for exercise 17B right now. One, 2, 3, 4. Ta, Tee, 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 Tik-A Tee, Tik-A ta, ta, Tee. Tee, 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 Tik-A Tee ta, Tee ta. Tee ta, ta, ta. All right, there you have it, exercise 17B. And I know that you already know this, but you know I have to say it. If you have not yet played exercise 17B on your instrument, especially if your principal instrument isn't the voice, it's really crucial that you do that step before moving on to the next exercise or the next rhythmic concept. One, 2, 3, 4. All right, that brings us to the end of this video and put some closure on week 16 and week 17, where we talked all about ties, the musical addition symbol, as well as invisible bar lines. We also talked in great detail about how ties can work in conjunction with invisible bar lines to help us better compartmentalize common time measures, so we can distinguish beats 1 and 2 from beats 3 and 4. We also learned in today's video that ties can actually create 8th note syncopation. They can create 16th note syncopation. They can create some really cool rhythms. We just need to understand how ties work in music notation and how they can work in correlation with the invisible bar line when applicable. So, thank you so much for joining me in today's video. In the next videos, week 18 and week 19, another 2-part video series, I will be discussing more simple time signatures. Now, if you don't know what a simple time signature is, then you definitely need to join me for week 18. Please do me a huge favor. Hit that like and subscribe button so you can help out the channel. It'll really help with the YouTube algorithm so these videos will reach more people and we can get more people becoming better rhythmic sight readers. And if you feel inspired, definitely leave a comment. I will reply to any and all comments. Again, thank you for joining me in today's video. I'll see you next time.